Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Love Letters from a Duke by Elizabeth Boyle, narrated by Susan Duerden. Prologue. June 4th, 1810. The Most Honourable the Marquis of Standon, Bythorn Castle, Westmoreland. My Lord Marquis, if you would but spare me a moment of patience and allow me to introduce myself, I think you will find my forthcoming proposition quite amenable. My name is Miss Felicity Langley, and I will graduate in a year from Miss Emery's establishment for the education of genteel ladies. A mutual friend of ours, Lord John Tremont, suggested I write to you and propose that we consider uniting in marriage. That is, once I've finished a brilliant season. You see, I have every intention of marrying a duke, and Jack thought you might prove a likely candidate, despite the fact that you have yet to inherit from your grandfather. Speaking of your esteemed grandsire, how is his health? An extract from Felicity Langley's correspondence to the Marquis of Standon. The Duke of Hollindrake's secretary laughed out loud. This was notable for two reasons. No one ever laughed in front of the imposing and impossibly ill-tempered Duke, and who would have ever thought that his straight-backed, pinched-nosed, impeccably mannered secretary, Mr. Gibbons, even knew how? And then he laughed again, guffawed really, out loud, and much to his employer's chagrin.
"Whatever has come over you, Gibbons? Have you gone mad?"
The Duke barked across the wide desk separating them.
"Control yourself this instant!"
Gibbons struggled to do just that, but it was of no use. His gaze slipped once again to the last line of the letter he had been reading, and he broke out in a loud gale of laughter, and continued until tears ran down his cheeks. It wasn't until he set aside the well-travelled post to retrieve a handkerchief from his waistcoat pocket and had a chance to wipe his eyes that he recovered enough to answer.
"My deepest apologies, Your Grace. It is just that—"
And then he started to stammer again, his eyes crinkling in the corners and his lips twitching rebelliously. He shook his head and pointed like a guilty child at the letter.
"Harumph! Whatever nonsense is this?"
the Duke asked as he reached for it.
"A letter, Your Grace,"
Gibbons managed.
"To your grandson." "Standon? Wherever would someone be writing him? Least of all have the nerve to send it here."
He eyed the missive in his hand as if it carried plague.
"Owes more money, does he? Well, I'm not paying his debts. I'm not, I say."
Standon and his grandfather had never seen eye to eye, having argued years earlier, resulting in the younger Sterling leaving England and his family without ever looking back. Of course, that had been well and good with the Duke, for his miscreant grandson had been the third son of a third son, so far removed from inheriting that his foibles and follies had been nothing more than a continuing annoyance rather than any grave concern. That is, until fate intervened. And now the young buck who'd driven his family mad with his exploits and then disappeared was the heir. So even as the old Duke made his strident declaration, to anyone who knew him, there was an odd wistful note behind his words. Regret, even.
"It isn't about debts, Your Grace," Gibbons explained. "Rather, the letter is from a young lady." "Got himself into that sort of trouble, eh? Not going to have some wench thinking she can wrangle a fortune?"
"No, Your Grace, it isn't that sort of, difficulty," Gibbons managed, for he was a lifelong bachelor and carried an unholy fear of the female sex. "Rather, it is from a lady, a proper one."
"A proper one, you say?"
Hollindrake brought the letter up for a closer examination.
"And from Bath, it appears," he said, looking at the directions. "What the devil is this Miss Emery's?"
"A school, Your Grace. I believe it teaches deportment and other such qualities."
"Churning out qualified flirts and silly chits, most likely," the old man said with a snort.
Yet
There was a glint of curiosity in his old roomy dark eyes. He looked up and pinned a glance on his secretary. "And what the devil did you find so amusing?" Gibbons choked and stammered. "Miss Langley writes to ask. That is, she is under the impression that, well, apparently—" "Out with it, man!" Hollindrake barked. The poor man took a deep breath, screwed up every bit of courage he possessed, and managed to get it all out in one sentence. "This Miss Langley is proposing that Lord Standon consider her hand in marriage." Gibbons then closed his eyes and braced himself for the impending explosion. None came, and after an indecent amount of silence, he peeked out through his lashes and discovered the old Duke engrossed in reading the letter for himself. Then the second noteworthy event occurred that day. The Duke laughed. "Some cheek," he said, once he gathered his wits about him. "She has the audacity to inquire about the state of my health. Probably be demmed disappointed to find me fit and hardy, I wager." He set the letter down on his desk and laughed again. "Yes, Your Grace," his secretary agreed. "Quite presumptuous." "Exactly," the Duke declared. "Which is why we are going to answer it." "Answer it, Your Grace?" A sense of foreboding ran down the secretary's spine. "Of course. Why, I suspect any chit with this much brass would make a most excellent duchess, and further, I'd wager she'd bring that rapscallion grandson of mine to heel." Gibbons's lips flapped like a fish out of water. "You mean to accept her proposal? But, Your Grace, you can hardly accept a proposal for your grandson on a matter such as this. Why, it's—" "I can, and I will," the old man said, sitting up straight and looking younger than he had in years. "So we will answer this, Miss Langley, and court her in his name. One day, Standon will thank me." And eventually he did. But not at first. Chapter 1. Aubrey Michael Thomas Stirling, Marquis of Standon, born 1780, third son of Lord Charles Stirling, current residence believed to be Bythorn Castle. Notes. Lord Standon poses a dilemma, for very little is known of him, though there are persistent and unsubstantiated rumours of youthful and rakish indiscretions. However, he must have reformed upon his elevation to the marquisate, for he is never mentioned in the society columns, the gentleman's magazine, or any other reliable form of gossip. As such, there is very little to recommend him, other than the indisputable fact that he is the Duke of Hollindrake's heir. An excerpt from the Bachelor Chronicles. Mayfair, London, January 1814. "Oh heavens, Tally, this is terrible news," Miss Felicity Langley announced to her sister Talia, who was seated across the sitting-room. "What is it?" her twin replied, looking up from her sketch pad. Felicity set down the copy of the Times she'd been reading and sighed. "Lord Garner died." "No." Tally got up from her chair by the window, and as she rose, her little black dog, Brutus, rose as well, stretching out his legs and yawning, before he followed his beloved mistress as she crossed the room to see the account for herself. "A riding accident! How dreadful!" "Terrible luck," Felicity muttered, as she dipped her quill into the inkpot and proceeded to strike Lord Garner's name from the open journal before her. "Heavens! That's the 5th bachelor this winter to expire," Tally said, as she watched her sister draw a series of lines through her careful reckoning of the now-deceased Baron's life and holdings. "Actually, the 6th. After giving her head a few woeful shakes, Tally asked, "This Lord Garner, he was rather old, wasn't he?" "Nearly 40. Her nose wrinkled. "Positively ancient. You should have crossed him out years ago." The twins had just turned 21 not a fortnight earlier, and Tally especially considered any man not in his 20s to be nothing short of a Methuselah. "Ancient or not, one cannot overlook 12,000 a year." Her twin shrugged, then glanced back at the paper.
An heir worth noting. A lad of 7.
A tusk was her sister's only reply, for she knew this meant that the new Lord Garner would have to wait another 10 years before he could even be considered eligible for inclusion in Felicity's infamous Bachelor Chronicles. Not that any man in his right mind would want to find himself inside the pages of such a journal. The Bachelor Chronicles, as they'd been dubbed by her classmates at Miss Emery's school, was far from being the giggling, foolish musings of a title-mad young lady, but rather a meticulously researched encyclopedia of every eligible bachelor in the ton. A volume of Debrett's could give you lineage and a family motto. The Bachelor Chronicles could tell you if the man had a penchant for drink and late-night rambles through the wilds of 7 Dials. Mr. Billingsworth's guidebooks and histories would give you an effusive and flowery travelogue of the man's holdings and properties, but Felicity's encyclopedia of dilettantes and Corinthians revealed the true condition of the roof and whether or not the walls were buttressed by mortgages or mortar. Dukes to barons, knighted gentlemen, and even a few men of means were given her discerning perusal. Even second sons and distant heirs found their way into the chronicles, because, as Felicity was wont to say, one day a spare, the next an heir. To accomplish all this, she spent the first few hours of each day scouring the Times, the Globe, and of course the Morning Post, as well as the latest volumes of the Gentleman's Magazine, the Ladies' Magazine, and the Ladies' Fashionable Cabinet, looking for information that would necessitate addendums or corrections to her chronicles. What she couldn't glean from the regular publications, she gathered by contacting Miss Emery's former students. A voluminous correspondence with these ladies, most of them having married into the loftiest families in society, gave her insights into her quarry that unfortunately never found their way into print.
"Tally, I am rethinking Pippin's future again," she said, after she'd carefully blotted the wet X running across Lord Garner's entry.
"Oh, Duchess, not again," Tally protested, using her favourite nickname for her sister. Felicity waved off her sister's objection.
"I'm more inclined to see our cousin with Lord Elmsley than the Earl of Dalton. I've just been informed by the Viscount's mother's second cousin's wife that Elmsley carries a bit of the romantic tragic about him, which would fit quite nicely with Pippin's current state."
Tally groaned, loudly.
"Don't do this," she told her sister.
"Leave Pippin be."
"Why ever for?"
"Because our poor cousin hasn't been the same since, well, you know." Felicity heaved a sigh.
"Her father's death was untimely, to say the least, and the shocking state of his finances even worse. But I dare say it is high time that she—"
"Stop!" Her sister threw her hands up.
"Sometimes I wonder if you even have a heart. I'm not talking about her father. I'm talking about him."
Tally lowered her voice to a whisper.
"Captain Dashwell."
"That pirate!" Felicity exclaimed.
"I won't hear that name mentioned again. Not in this house. Oh, how I wish the devil would take him to the bottom of the sea. Pippin was such a sensible creature before that wastrel kissed her."
4 years earlier, during Felicity's first matchmaking endeavour, she, Tally and Pippin had become entangled in more than assisting their teacher, Miss Porter, find her heart's desire with the rakish Jack Tremont. Rather, they'd discovered themselves in the middle of an elaborate network of spies and espionage, and had stood in for Jack when their misadventures accidentally landed him in prison. And that one night had changed their lives forever, ending with Pippin being kissed by a young American sea captain, Thomas Dashwell, as they exchanged gold for passengers from France. It had happened in the flash of an eye, but to hear their cousin recall the night, it was as if she and Dash had spent an eternity in each other's arms. Nonsense, really, Felicity had told them both on numerous occasions. Captain Dashwell was a murderous, ruinous, dreadful pirate, best forgotten, or better yet, hung from the nearest yardarm. For not long afterward, the brash American had gone from being their ally to their enemy as their two countries plunged into war. And since then, his daring and audacious pirating had cost England dearly. Tally's blue eyes sparkled.
You're just jealous he didn't kiss you. I am not, Felicity told her. I'd have shot the scallywag before he'd come close enough to dare. Oh, come now. You don't want to end your days never having been kissed, do you?
Tally gathered her dog Brutus into her arms, fluffing the mane of fur that ringed his monkey-like face. Felicity's hand came to rest atop her volume of Debrett's, its thick weight just the right foundation from which to launch her argument.
Tally, kissing is out of the question. If I thought for a moment either of you two were going to run about kissing every pirate and rapscallion you cross paths with, I would never have gone to such lengths to get us to town for the season. Can't you see that this house, Aunt Minty, our very reputations are at stake? If any of us are impugned, if anyone were to discover the lengths we've gone to, well, you've gone to, Tally corrected. I'm not the one getting transported for any of this. Besides, I'm with Pippin on this, Duchess. I'd prefer to find my own husband, not one of your approved dullards. I want a man like Captain Dashwell, who will kiss me senseless and leave me willing to dare anything. Well, of all the ungrateful...
Felicity drew an even breath.
Please do not wax poetic about kissing pirates in my presence. Why, it isn't done. Not by us. You both must marry well. For how can I have a cousin, least of all a sister, who isn't as well connected as I am when I am Hollindrake's bride?
Tally set Brutus down.
When? Don't you mean if?
Felicity shot her sister a hot glance.
I will marry the Duke and no one else. But, dearling...
Tally was cut off by the bell at the front door, the insistent and unexpected clamour causing them both to start.
Heavens! Who could that be?
Then she froze, her face growing pale as she glanced around the salon that served as their day room.
You don't think that someone has discovered? Certainly not, Felicity said, though not completely convinced. But I suppose we must see who it is. I'm not going to jail, Duchess,
her sister repeated, as she had every day since they'd come to town.
Yes, Tally, I know,
Felicity replied. She gathered up her shawl from the back of the chair and tossed it over her shoulders before she left the warmth of the upstairs sitting room, the only warm room in the house, Tally liked to grumble, to do what one usually left to a servant, only they hadn't any. Tally followed hot on her heels, and where Tally went, so did Brutus, who never let his mistress get too far out of his sight. He barked and growled, setting up a loud ruckus that echoed through the mostly empty Mayfair mansion they'd taken for the season. Though of noble breeding, his grandsire, Tally liked to tell anyone who would listen, had belonged to Marie Antoinette, Brutus possessed the manners of a spit dog. Felicity glanced over her shoulder at the parade behind her and shook her head.
Keep him from chewing on whoever it is, will you, Tally? I am still trying to determine how we will pay for the damage to Mr. Elliot's boots.
Her sister groaned.
Some solicitor served that old pinch-purse right.
She cleared her throat, and when she spoke again, it was with the man's stoic pitch.
A season? Why, a dreadful waste of money. Economise, dear girls. Now, that's the best course of action, given your situation.
She sputtered and growled, not unlike the noise Brutus was making.
That cheap, wretched bastard, Talia!
Felicity heaved a beleaguered sigh. Not that she didn't share her sister's sentiments about their solicitor, but she preferred to take a more ladylike stance on the matter.
Remember what Nanny Bridget always said. The rare man is the one who looks toward a lady's future. Yes, well, Nanny Bridget wasn't living in an empty mansion, scratching by on her pin money, now was she? She muttered back. But still, she scooped Brutus up as they turned at the landing and soothed the little beast with some softly spoken assurances. Another pair of boots would cut dearly into their already meagre budget. As the bell jangled with yet another insistent and discordant peal, Tally heaved a sigh. Heavens! How terribly rude they are. Why don't we have Mrs. Hutchinson get that? Mrs. Hutchinson is indisposed, Felicity supplied.
There was an indelicate snort from behind her.
Mrs. Hutchinson isn't indisposed. She's tangle-footed. Could you be a bit more discreet?
Felicity said over her shoulder as she rounded the second landing.
What if someone heard you? How would it look if word got out that our household has some irregularities? We live in an empty house, my dearest Duchess, Tally replied. It won't be long before someone notices. And that housekeeper you hired does us no favours. The woman is a tosspot, a drunkard, top-heavy, a high-goer. Yes. So she's got a slight penchant for brandy, but her wages are what we can afford. Nice of her to work for brandy, I suppose, Tally said. And thank God we were able to liberate so many bottles from Uncle's cellars before we left Sussex, or we'd be up to our necks in debt with the spirit merchant's bill.
Felicity did her best to ignore Tally's lamentations.
Don't be so dramatic. Mrs. Hutchinson is merely unavailable to answer the door, and that is all it is.
Yes, if only that was all, Tally said, sharing a sceptical glance with Brutus. The bell jangled again, and whoever was on the other side had an annoyingly persistent way of yanking it into such a discordant clamour it was getting on Felicity's nerves.
When I am the Duchess of Hollindrake,
she muttered, as visions of an endless supply of coal, servants and respectable housekeepers danced before her eyes.
Yes, wouldn't that be lovely?
Tally agreed quickly.
We'll be living around the corner on Grosvenor Square, warm and snug, without the least bit of economies.
She paused for a moment and let a wicked little grin tip her lips.
And most likely employ a housekeeper who doesn't drink. What do you think? Do you think the Duke's housekeeper drinks because...
She stopped mid-sentence, her mouth falling open in a wide moo.
You don't think that perhaps he drinks, and that's why you haven't heard from him in so long? With his grandfather's death, maybe he's fallen into a dark and dangerous decline. Oh, dear Felicity, what if he's turned into a rumpot and intends never to marry? Piffle, Felicity declared. Aubrey Michael Thomas Sterling, the 10th Duke of Hollindrake, would never turn into a rumpot. He hasn't such a nature.
With her nose in the air, she did her best to set aside the niggle of doubt her sister had managed to plant inside the armour she wore when it came to all matters pertaining to the Duke.
How do you know? Tally argued. You've never met the man.
Felicity wheeled around.
Not know him? What a ridiculous thing to say. I've been corresponding with him for 4 years. I believe that counts as knowing him.
Tally reached over, took her sister's hand and squeezed it.
Dear Duchess, he hasn't written in months, not since his grandfather died. Even you must admit that something has...
To her credit, she didn't say, gone wrong.
Changed,
she finally finished.
Of course his situation has changed.
Felicity set off again for the door.
He's a man with vast responsibilities now. He can hardly be expected to be writing to me constantly. As you say, Tally agreed. Perhaps that's him now, come to call to sweep you off your feet and take us all to his glorious house. Would be quite convenient, since we haven't enough coal to last the week.
For a moment, Felicity gave herself over to Tally's fanciful prattle. Coal and candles, and enough tea in the chest to make a decent pot of pekoe, and the sugar to go in it as well. But as a draught raced past her, the chill, along with her sister's dire words, brought her back to her senses. Why had he suddenly stopped writing? Not even a response to her perfectly penned note of condolence. It was as if he was the one who'd gone aloft, not his grandfather. Oh, whatever had gone wrong? As the bell jangled again, Tally groaned at the clamour.
Sound as presumptuous as a duke, don't they? Should I check the window for a coach and four before you answer it?
Felicity shook her head.
That could hardly be Hollindrake.
She nodded toward the bracket clock their father had sent them the year before.
It's too early for callers. Besides, he'd send around his card or a note before he just arrived at our doorstep. Not even a duke would be so forward to call without sending word.
Sweeping her hands over her skirt and then patting her hair to make sure it was in place, Felicity was actually relieved it couldn't be her duke calling, for she still hadn't managed a way to gain them new wardrobes, let alone more coal. But she had a good week to solve those problems, at least until the House of Lords reconvened, for then Hollindrake would have to come to town to formally claim his title and take his oath of allegiance.
So who do you think it is?
Tally was asking as she clung to a squirming Brutus. Taking another quick glance at the clock, Felicity let out a big sigh.
How could I have forgotten? The agency sent around a note yesterday that they had found us a footman who met our requirements.
Tally snorted. What? He doesn't need a wage and won't rob us blind? Felicity glanced toward the ceiling and shook her head.
Of course I plan on paying him. Eventually. And since we have nothing worth stealing, that shouldn't be an issue.
The bell jangled again, and this time Brutus squirmed free of his mistress's grasp, racing in anxious circles around the hem of Tally's gown and barking furiously. Well, if there was any consolation, Felicity mused as she crossed the foyer and caught hold of the latch, whoever was being so insistent was about to have his boots ruined. Taking a deep breath, she tugged the door open and found herself staring into a dark green greatcoat, which her gaze dismissively sped over, for it sported only one poor cape. The owner stood hunched forward, the brim of his hat tipped down to shield him from the wintry chill.
"May I help you?"
Felicity asked, trying to tamp down the shiver that rose up her spine. It wasn't that she'd been struck by a chill, for this mountain of a man was blocking the razor-cold wind. No, rather, it was something she didn't quite understand. And then she did. As this stranger slowly straightened, the brim of his hat rose, revealing a solid, masculine jaw, covered in a hint of dark stubble that did little to obscure the strong cleft in his chin, nor hide a pair of firm lips. From there sat a Roman nose, set into his features with a noble sort of craggy fortitude. But it was his eyes that finally let loose that odd shiver through her limbs with an abandon that not even she could tamp down. His gaze was as dark as night, a pair of eyes the colour of Russian sable, mysterious and deep, rich and full of secrets. Felicity found herself mesmerised, for all she could think about was something Pippin had once confessed, that from the very moment she'd looked into Captain Dashwell's eyes, she'd just known he was going to kiss her. A ridiculous notion, Felicity had declared at the time, but suddenly she understood what her cousin had been saying, for right now she knew there was no way on earth she was going to go to her grave without having once had her lips plundered thoroughly and spectacularly by this man, until her toes curled up in her slippers and she couldn't breathe. She didn't know how she knew such a thing, but she just did. "I'm here to see Miss Langley," he said. His deep voice echoed with a rough, smoky quality, from the authority in his taut stance to the arch of his brow as he looked down at her, clearly as surprised to find a lady answering her own door as she was to find him standing on her steps. He left her staggering with one unbelievable thought, and her shiver immediately turned to panic.
"This is him,"
her heart sang.
"Please let this be him."
Hollindrake. She struggled to find the words to answer him, but for the first time in her life, Felicity Langley found herself speechless. She moved her lips, tried to talk, tried to be sensible, but it was impossible under this imposing man's scrutinizing gaze. Yet, how could this be? What was he doing here, calling on her, and at such an unfashionable hour? And no wonder he was staring at her, for her hair wasn't properly fixed, her dress 4 years out of fashion, and her feet. Dear God, she'd answered the door wearing red wool socks. Tally nudged her from behind.
"Felicity, say something."
Reluctantly wrenching her gaze away from his mesmerising countenance, composing herself, she focused on what it was one said to their nearly betrothed. But in those moments, Felicity's dazzled gaze took in the coat once again, with its shockingly worn cuffs. Worn cuffs? Oh no, that wasn't right. And where there should be a pair of perfectly cut breeches were a pair of patched trousers. Patched? but the final evidence that cooled her wayward thoughts more thoroughly than the icy floor that each morning met her toes.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?